Well, out of all the side characters that appeared in Legends of Runeterra, if there is one I didn't expect to get their own story, it would be Professor von Yipp. And yet, here we are, staring at a really long story, telling the tale of this person, which only further supplements all the story they got through their cards. Up until now, it was never directly confirmed whether Professor von Yipp is the person or the cat. But that changes today, because that's exactly what this story is about. And so, without further ado, let's dive into the story called To Herd a Cat. Be wary, especially if you own a cat, this is a really good story. The story begins in the professor's messy and white-haired covered laboratory, where he flipped a switch that lit up the place for just a moment, enough to show his impish grin. He was getting ready to show everyone what he's truly capable of. Apparently, everyone thought he was annoying and disappointing, and that all his inventions were just expensive paperwork. Well, he was ready to change that. He tried to flip the second switch, but it stuck a little. Probably from when Muchka, his fluffy cat, spilled coffee all over it. It took him 3 tries before successfully pulling it down. As a low hum started vibrating through the laboratory, the professor explained that none of the others at the University of Piltover's engineering department knew how difficult it was to climb the ladder of academia without the support of a wealthy family. And yet, here he was, overcoming a massive disadvantage. After flipping the third switch, his machine, which he worked on for so many years now, was ready for the second phase. But before that was initiated, the professor noticed that Muchka was missing. She was supposed to be strapped into her chair. After crawling across the entire place, he finally found his truest white-haired companion curled up under the bed, just outside of his reach. Here the story revealed that Muchka was always there with the professor. She listened and supported him whenever he had to rant about his colleagues. And in return, all she ever asked for was to get fed on time. The professor's voice softened when he grabbed Muchka and tried to put her back in her chair. At first she wiggled a bit, and so he offered her a treat first. She threw it on the ground as her usual pre-eating ritual, after which she calmed down. And so the professor strapped her into the chair and attached a small metal cap onto her head. On the other side of the machine, buzzing with excitement, the professor strapped himself into a similar harness, with his own metal cap covered with hex crystals. He had spent almost a decade researching them, and finding ones with the right resonance, power and intensity. With proper funding, he could have finished his work 3 years ago, but without it he had to do all the hextech research himself. After this, the professor practiced for the time he would demonstrate this machine to Dean Svopalit. And so he explained that after pulling the last lever, he would prove that minds were not rooted in bodies at all, that brain was merely a housing for the mind and identity, and everyone would see how wrong they were about him. It would be the time Professor Andrei von Yipp would be appreciated. And so, with his heart pounding, he pulled the lever. He felt a jolt travel through his body as his eyes rolled back in his head. Muchka's wail rang in his ears. And then he blinked, adjusting to a new brightness. At first he wondered if he accidentally turned the lights on. Then he wondered if he had lost consciousness. He wondered how much time had passed. Then he noticed the horrible smell. Von Yipp's nose twitched, and so he sneezed 3 times. But it sounded different. It was an adorable tiny sneeze. Von Yipp looked down at his hands. No, his paws. Muchka's paws. He had done it. He tried to say, but it came out as a satisfied purr. Haha! He realized he can now make cat sounds. Touching his fuzzy little face with his new paws, Von Yipp laughed. Rather, he chittered. In the light, he had successfully switched his bodies with... He suddenly recognized the smell. It was smoke. He used his paws to remove his tiny metal cap, only to realize that several of the gems began to melt and sizzle into steam. What's worse, they were irreplaceable. Many of them were one-off pieces that couldn't be recreated, and so he quickly had to swap their bodies back, before the crystals were destroyed. Thankfully, Von Yipp installed a second tiny lever on the cat's side too. But when he tried to pull it with his paws, it held fast. He tried using more force. He even got out of his harness and used his full weight. but the lever was metal and slippery, and he couldn't hold onto it without the cap slipping off. "Drat," he meowed. "This would be so much easier to operate with thumbs." That's when he realized his other body still had thumbs. And so he meowed at Muchka to see if she could understand him. In response, she just screamed back. She strained against the harness in panic. Then, in Von Yipp's voice, Muchka shouted that she wanted to get out. She didn't want to be there. The professor was amazed by how quickly Muchka picked up on using human language. He meowed at her that she can release herself by pressing the middle button, hoping she would understand him. Muchka looked down and bent over. It seemed like she tried to bite the button, but her new human body wasn't flexible enough. So she shouted at Von Yipp to do it himself. Von Yipp jumped onto her lap and pressed the button. At least he was glad to know that she could understand him. After releasing her, Muchka fell on the ground, trying to figure out how human limbs work. The professor then quickly jumped back into his seat, and he told Muchka to help him with the lever. But she didn't want to. She wanted to stay where she was. Von Yipp hissed at her, but before he could do anything else, he looked up and noticed the crystals had completely melted. It took him a moment to realize that now he was stuck in the body of a cat. But what was even worse, after looking at Muchka, who was trying and failing to crawl under the bed, he realized that she was stuck in his. A wave of catastrophizing anxiety washed over him, which resulted in him vomiting a disgusting hairball. Everyone would now know that Von Yipp was an idiot after all. Instead of changing the course of history, he turned himself into a cat. Soon, without a way to earn a living, he would lose his apartment and spend his life on the streets as a stray cat, hunting the mice of Zoon. In his mind, there was no way forward. That's when Muchka screamed as loud as she could. Von Yipp began to panic. Had his body been hurt? Would he lose an arm, a leg, an eye? Would there be anything left to return to one day? He sprinted to Muchka, jumped on her chest, and asked what was wrong. Muchka stopped screaming. She looked Von Yipp dead in the eye and shouted, "Hungry!" "Hungry?" the professor asked, not sure whether to be relieved or angry. "You're screaming because you're hungry? That body wasn't hungry the last time I was in it." "I'm wasting away!" Muchka wailed. "Skin and bone, starved, close to death." Von Yipp quickly calmed her down. It was middle of the night, and he really didn't want anyone to pay him a visit now. Von Yipp tried to explain that she can't get food just by screaming. But Muchka was confused. It has always worked, so why wouldn't it work now? Von Yipp tried to tell her that usually he was the one feeding her. But Muchka interrupted him. "Dying! Underfed! Never had a single bite of food in all my life!" Thankfully, the professor remembered he still had some pastry in his pocket. So Muchka shoved her hand in the pocket, and somehow, without using her fingers properly, she pried it out and let it fall down. Then Von Yipp was forced to watch his own body eat it off the ground. He realized that despite Muchka having a human body, she still behaved like a cat. It was a vindication of his theory, though he wished he could enjoy it more. In 2 days he had a meeting with the dean, and he would have to appear before her as normal as could be, and try to convince her to give him more money. He knew he couldn't repair his machine in time, so he would have to propose a new project. Something that would make his transformation seem deliberate, designed to show off his genius in a unique and creative manner. It would be a challenge, but not impossible. He just needed to help Muchka act like a human during the meeting, and to hope that Dean Svopalit was in a good mood. After watching Muchka try to bury the rest of the pastry in the cold concrete, Von Yipp told her he knew where to get more, though she would have to listen to him. Not like that time he tried to teach her how to use a toilet. And just as he said that, he realized sooner or later he would have to teach Muchka how to use a toilet. There was a moment of silence before Muchka replied, "I'm still hungry!" The story then cuts to the day Von Yipp had a meeting with the dean. The professor and Muchka were at the university tower. But that place had some special rules, such as the damage caused by a professor can be justified depending on how good their invention is, But also, unfortunately, no animals were allowed in the area. And out of all the people, Dean Swopalit was the one who insisted upon that rule. Originally, von Yipp wanted to let Muchka smuggle him inside the university under a coat. But he didn't own a coat, and letting Muchka come here alone was out of question. So even though Muchka couldn't even remember simple phrases such as "lovely weather today, isn't it?" or "please," or not knocking over mugs filled with hot coffee, they still had no other option than to just march in, with von Yipp sitting on Muchka's shoulder. The moment they reached the first door, von Yipp asked Muchka if she remembers how to open doors. She replied no, and so he told her to use her thumbs, to which Muchka replied she didn't like thumbs, they felt weird. So instead, she used the palms of both of her hands to twist the knob and get inside. There, Muchka didn't like how many students walked around, but thankfully, by now, von Yipp told her not to scream when she was displeased. So instead, she just whispered, "Too many people, I don't like it." Von Yipp told her that she would have to walk through them, and he assured her that none of them will step on her tail. And they didn't. Though Muchka was still uncomfortable, so she drew herself high and hissed. Von Yipp reminded her that people don't hiss. It didn't take long, and after von Yipp's constant loud meowing, the students cleared the halls, because they knew animals were against the rules, and they didn't want to be present when the dean got angry. Finally, they found the dean's office and stepped inside. Dean Swopalit was sitting behind her desk, going through some papers. She asked von Yipp what he wanted to talk about, but she immediately froze when she looked up. Von Yipp could see sign of angry and explosive lecturing on her face. And so he whispered to Muchka to tell her she looks well rested. But instead, Muchka leaned over the desk, blinked slowly, and told her, "Would you like a pastry?" Von Yipp feared that would be the sentence Muchka would remember. With calm voice, Dean Swopalit said, "Close the door now." As soon as the door was shut, von Yipp braced himself for the yelling. But instead, he felt himself being lifted from Muchka's shoulder. He panicked and started wiggling. He wasn't sure if the dean was going to throw him out the window. But when he looked up, he saw the biggest smile he had ever seen. The dean then asked, "Who is this little girl?" There was a moment of silence before von Yipp told Muchka to tell her his name. And so Muchka replied, "Von Yipp." The dean shook her head and replied, "Only you would name a cat after yourself, Andrei." Von Yipp then told Muchka to tell her her name. And so Muchka quickly said, "Oh, Muchka." That's when it became obvious why the dean did not allow any animals in the campus. She would have to cuddle them all, and it was embarrassing. The dean then told von Yipp to not tell anyone about this. And then they got to the matter at hand. She knew von Yipp wanted more funds, but she simply didn't have time. To argue back, von Yipp told Muchka to listen to him and repeat exactly what he said. And so, with von Yipp's frantic meows on Muchka's shoulder, they were able to have a conversation with the dean, with Muchka repeating every word. Von Yipp tried to argue that he had been at the university for 13 years, but the dean told him that he had not done much in this time. However, there was a way to make the university interested in investing in him. He could teach a class. Von Yipp agreed that he could do that if he had the time to prepare, but the dean told him that Professor Bunce, who was teaching first-year students, had to unexpectedly leave. And so he would have to take his class. Of course, von Yipp hated children. And after he had a little monologue about these first-year imbeciles, Muchka whispered to him if she should also tell the dean about how much he hates children. Instead, von Yipp told her that he will take the class. Swopalit was glad to hear that, and she told him that the class is in room 217. He better hurry. Von Yipp was shocked to hear that the class starts right now, but the dean replied that it was just intro to hexographs. Even Muchka could teach it. The story then cuts to Muchka trying to hold a piece of chalk between her palms. It was all going to be excruciating. During their introduction, while telling everyone von Yipp would be their professor for the semester, Muchka didn't even know how to say the word semester, and she didn't even know how to write letters. So Von Yipp told her to copy the shapes he was drawing with his paws. He traced out his name on the desk, letter by letter. Muchka stared, gears visibly turning in her head, as she wrote a gross approximation of Professor Von Yipp on the board, chalk held between her palms. This took 6 full minutes. Thankfully, none of the students noticed the professor couldn't write, because they were all staring at the cat. After a while, a student stood up, saying that she wanted to let Professor Von Yipp know where Professor Buns left off. And so Von Yipp let the student recite from her notebook. As she did that, a bit later the student asked if the professor was even listening. Von Yipp looked to the side and saw Muchka trying to curl into a ball on the ground, head down in her hands. She wondered how could people sleep when their back was so not flexible. After Von Yipp yelled at her, she replied she was resting her eyes. She said this loudly so that the students could all hear. She said that if they were so boring that they would make her fall asleep, they would get a failing grade. Von Yipp didn't think this was the worst approach to teaching, and so Muchka continued. Yeah, you'll get a failing grade. With his enhanced hearing, Von Yipp heard what the students were mumbling about. They knew this class was difficult, but they wondered if this was some kind of a test. There had to be a reason for this. They thought that maybe Von Yipp was trying to teach them to present better, so that they could get funding for their experiments. And so, the next time the student continued reading from her notebook, she did it with bigger hand motions and metaphors. After the student finished, Muchka opened her eyes and thanked her for explaining well. At Von Yipp's command, Muchka then sent the students home. There was supposed to be a full hour of lecture, but none of the students mentioned it. After they had all left, Muchka whined that she was hungry again. She wanted to go home. So Von Yipp agreed. He hopped onto her shoulder as she bumped into yet another wall. He wondered how long they could keep this up. The story then cuts to a few weeks later. While he himself had hard time adjusting to the life of a cat, he noticed that over time, while Muchka was still a cat, her attention span and level of care seemed to have gone up, and now she could even pronounce some of the more difficult terminology. With Von Yipp's help, Muchka explained that her awkward movement was the result of a summer injury. She also seemed to enjoy giving their students caustic feedback whenever they answered incorrectly. And Von Yipp wondered if this progress was because her mind was in a human brain, and whether the brain structure does actually affect the mind. He was still trying to figure out how to reveal himself to his colleagues, but until that right moment, they still had to pretend everything was normal. And Muchka always found ways to make this more difficult. At this point, her nails were disgustingly long and filthy, so Von Yipp told her to cut them. Muchka wondered why couldn't she just scratch things until they fell off, and Von Yipp explained that human nails didn't work like that. She would be left with a bunch of bleeding fingers. Muchka thought that the right solution to that would be to not cut them then. At first, Von Yipp told her that the students would soon complain about her hygiene. But knowing well this argument wouldn't help, he also added that she would go to jail. Muchka answered, okay, because she didn't know what jail was. Von Yipp compared it to the harness of his machine, which she hated so much. Muchka rolled her eyes. She didn't care about going to jail, because even if she did, she would just wiggle out of it, like she always did. Von Yipp was starting to get a headache. He spat out that jail is not something she can wiggle out of. She would go there for not trimming her nails, and the wardens would give her food she didn't like. Muchka told him she would cry, but Von Yipp answered they wouldn't care. Muchka continued that he always cared when she cried, but Von Yipp replied that's because she was a cat. Now that she was a human, she wasn't cute anymore. Muchka gasped, eyes wide. Evidently, this was a revelation to her. Because she was in his body, she wasn't cute, and so she couldn't do whatever she wanted anymore. Muchka stared into the distance, brow furrowed in thought. Von Yipp wondered if he had gone too far, but she needed to realize there were different rules for when she was cute and tiny and fluffy. You might be less powerful in some ways, but in other ways you called all the shots. An interesting thought, Von Yipp realized. Muchka walked to the machine and in the metal parts she saw her own reflection. She felt hideous and she wanted Von Yipp to change her back. Von Yipp told her that he couldn't do that. They didn't have the right crystals. So she had to listen to him if she wanted to avoid going to jail. Fine, she huffed. I'll trim my nails. And wash your hair. With water? We didn't agree to that. This was going to be a long night. A month later, the dean's calendar finally opened up, so Muchka and von Yipp once again visited her office. I have heard some reports from your students, Dean Svopalit said. But Muchka changed the subject. She and von Yipp had been rehearsing this speech for a full week now. I hope you have seen that I am committed to this university, she said in one go. And now I feel I deserve the funding for a new project of mine. She took a deep, gasping breath. So if you would be so kind to give me your stamp of approval. Dean told them to slow down. She had no idea what they were saying. Muchka looked to von Yipp for approval. He gave her a small nod. I hope... She began, going as slowly as she could. You have seen that... Enough. The dean looked annoyed. From your midterm reviews, it sounds like things are going reasonably well. A few complaints, but it's just an intro-level class. No one really cares so long there's a warm body up front. It's basically babysitting. Von Yipp meowed his agreement. Now, you've mentioned you want funding for a new project. Muchka nodded. The dean was glad to hear that after tinkering with the theory of mind machine for so long, he admitted defeat. It was a foolish attempt. Anyway, all he had to do was to sign some paperwork to get the funding. Thankfully, the two had been practicing writing, with Muchka following the lines von Yipp made with his paw. She wasn't good, but at least it was legible now. Even so, it had taken weeks to fill out the paperwork by hand, as the clacking keys of typograph scared Muchka and gave von Yipp migraines. But now, with all the paperwork done, the dean told von Yipp there was one more step to do. He would have to find some graduate students to work on his new project. And thankfully, she had a very tall stack of folders with their personal information. But she warned von Yipp that most of the good ones had already been taken. The story then cuts to the day von Yipp was going to meet the students who could potentially work on his project. He didn't have an office at the university, so now he was sitting in an unused room which used to be a lavatory. The room was so small he couldn't fit a desk and a person inside at the same time, so the interviews took place with the students sitting in the middle of the doorway. Throughout these interviews, it all came down to the most important question. Von Yipp told Muchka, ask her about a time when completing the experiment was more important than following protocol or ethical standards. So far, everyone gave the wrong answer, just like the young woman before them now. She answered, never. An experiment that doesn't follow protocol is one where the results can easily be called into question, and I strive to... Von Yipp didn't listen to the rest. He knew she was out, but he let Muchka finish the interview, and kindly inform her that they would let her know within 2 weeks whether she got the position. The young woman shrugged, seemingly no longer interested, before she stood to leave. After her, Muchka pushed the next file towards von Yipp. It was the last one, and then they would go get pastries. At the back of his mind, von Yipp was worried about his body. Muchka lacked proper nutrition, and her human body was beginning to look pallid and undernourished. Anyway, von Yipp paused when he noticed the file contained 2 names. It seemed like they accidentally booked 2 people at once. Moments later, the 2 men stepped before von Yipp's door. One of them with a long face and a thick mustache, the other with big sideburns and a mug of steaming tea. The mustachioed one remained standing, while the man with the sideburns took a seat. Muchka looked at them and wanted to let them know that they had made a mistake. But the sitting man interrupted her, telling her they haven't. The 2 were a package deal. Jakub and Natias Batadel. The interview went as usual, until they got to the most important part. Tell me about the time when completing the experiment was more important than following protocol or ethical standards, Muchka said. The 2 brothers glanced at each other. Then Jakub cleared his throat, but Natias was the one who answered. There was a part we needed that was not available anywhere in Piltover, so we got it elsewhere. Muchka replied that it doesn't sound like a breach of protocol, but Jakub said quietly, it was Chemtech. Von Yipp blinked. Chemtech came from Zone, and it was not well regarded in Piltover. No matter where it appeared, it always made all inventions unstable. Or if not more unstable, it certainly made unstable machines more dangerous. What in the world did they need Chemtech for? Von Yipp wondered aloud. Muchka asked the question, and Yipp shrugged. We were creating something that we wanted only one person to be able to operate. We were investigating what makes each person unique, and how much a person can change while remaining themselves. When the interview ended, before Muchka could tell them the standard "we'll be in touch," Von Yipp told her to tell them they've got the job. Muchka looked at the brothers, considering, as Natias took another sip of a tea. She locked eyes with him and asked, "How is your drink?" He blinked in surprise as he put down the mug. "It's good," he said, "but it's a little cold now. I'll probably just..." Without breaking eye contact, Muchka slowly pushed the mug off the side of the desk. It fell on the ground and shattered, tea spilling all over the floor. Von Yipp, amused by this improvised test, watched the brothers to see how they would respond to such behavior from a professor. Neither Yipp nor Natias batted an eye. "You've got the job," Muchka said. Yipp nodded. "And what is the job? I'll tell you more when we get our approvals." The story then cuts to Muchka and Von Yipp being in the dean's office. The dean seemed annoyed. Apparently, the Battledale brothers were nearly suspended last year, and they weren't allowed to sign up for the more advanced courses. But thankfully for Von Yipp, that meant they had more time to work on his project. On the other side, the dean was frustrated because Von Yipp was supposed to have the full description of his new project ready by now. This is when another problem arrived. As the dean was talking, with every wave of her hand, the sunlight from the window behind her reflected off of her watch. Von Yipp's cat body really wanted to chase the light, but he was able to resist the urge. Muchka, on the other side, kept following the dot with her gaze, not paying attention to the conversation at all. The dean tried to follow Muchka's eyes to see what she was looking at, but she quickly gave up. Then the dean said that Von Yipp comes here again and again, begging for funds for a project that will change everything, and yet he couldn't even give her his full attention. Muchka tried to reply, but her thoughts trailed off with the dot of light. That's when the dean snapped. Now she actually believed that Von Yipp was mad. She was tired of funneling his ego-driven projects and seeing nothing come of it. No usable data or even salvageable discoveries. On top of that, now he shrouded his ideas in mystery. In her eyes, Von Yipp thought that the drama of a reveal is more important than proper oversight. So she told him, it is not. Von Yipp could feel the growl begin in the back of his throat, and before he knew it, he lunged, claws outstretched, toward the dean. Muchka blinked back into reality, just long enough to restrain him. The dean sniffed. "You'll need to get rid of your cat." "What?" Muchka replied. While the dean thought the cat was cute, bringing her here was still an obvious sign of disrespect. Von Yipp was furious now. And if he had his own human body, he would be throwing things. It was all so unfair. How could he show his true potential when he was suppressed at every step by an unwilling dean? He extended a single claw and scratched at the desk. "Keep your animal off my desk!" Swopalit shrieked as she lifted Von Yipp's cat body by the scruff of the neck. "This is an antique. It... The dean was silenced by what she saw. Into the lacquered wood, Von Yipp had carved IMV. He no longer cared if he gave the game away, so his colleagues would know what had happened, and he would be laughed out of the university. Fine, at least the dean would have to go to work every day and see how wrong she was about him when she sat down at this desk. He knew what he was doing. His machines worked, and worked beautifully. How dare she talk about things she knew nothing about? Von Yipp was a genius. He knew it in his tiny cat bones. If only he had been able to finish writing his name. She stared at it, and stared, and stared. "Von Yipp," she said softly. A cloud moved in front of the sun, freeing Muchka from the bouncing light's beautiful tyranny. Dean Swopalit. "You didn't tell me that you were working on animal intelligence," she squealed. "No wonder Muchka has been accompanying you everywhere." What else can she do?" Von Yipp was taken aback by this sudden turn, but he'd be damned if she let this go to waste. "Muchka, ask me what 52 times 21 is." Muchka, what is 52 times 21? Taking pleasure in destroying the dean's desk further, Von Yipp carved 1092 into it. The dean gasped and clasped her hands. Why, this is remarkable, Andre. We've been trying and failing to enhance animal intelligence for years. But you... She paused and looked at the human in front of her. You've done something no one else could. And with a dramatic reveal, no less. I was wrong about you. She extended her hand for a handshake. Muchka stared at it, unsure what to do. Shake her hand! You've seen me do it before. Muchka slapped her palm against the Dean's, still refusing to use her thumb to make a firm grip. Now, said the Dean Svopolit, nonplussed as she sat behind her desk once again. Let's talk funding. Just like we have practiced, hold the pencil, follow the movements of my paw, and replicate what I'm doing. Yeah, I'll try. Muchka had already lost several pencils under the bed, but von Yipp did not feel like fishing them out for her. It took hours of careful sketching, erasing, and restarting. But eventually, Muchka had produced a reasonable approximation of what they needed to build. Von Yipp looked at it with pride. With her help, with the Dean's funding, with the Batadels brothers' assistance, von Yipp would show them all what a real scientist could do. And these blueprints would be the first step toward making that a reality. Cue the dramatic reveal. The catastrophe exosuit. Animal intelligence indeed. What a story. First of all, I didn't expect von Yipp to get his own story, let alone expect that this would definitely be among my top 3 standalone stories. If you really think about it, this entire story is depressing. Because based on the cards we got in Legends of Runeterra, we know that von Yipp won't figure out how to swap their bodies back. And something will probably go wrong with his suit. And because cats usually live up to only 18 years, he is quickly running out of time. And that's why he is forced to artificially prolong his life with augments. On top of that, the story hinted at the fact that von Yipp is losing his humanity, and he is becoming more and more cat-like, while Muchka is taking over his body. And because the story revealed that von Yipp was actually a decently nice person, it's that much sadder to see him fall towards the darker side. Overall, I really hope we get more stories about him. This character has insane potential. And while I still don't think that von Yipp will be the next champion, I still wish he will become a champion at some point.